Racist doctor insults black woman. Then finds out she's the hospital director's wife. Leah smoothed her tailored blazer as she stepped through the sliding glass doors of Metropolitan General Hospital, her Louboutin heels clicking purposefully against the polished floor. The morning light filtered through the vast windows, casting long shadows across the modernist lobby where patients and staff moved in their usual careful choreography. She'd chosen her outfit deliberately for this routine checkup, professional, understated elegance that usually commanded respect in the corporate boardrooms where she spent most of her time. The registration desk loomed ahead, staffed by 3 receptionists engaged in quiet conversation. As Leah approached, their laughter died abruptly, replaced by meaningful glances exchanged between them. The youngest receptionist, whose name tag read Amanda, straightened up, her welcoming smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Good morning," Leah said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of her Ivy League education. "I have a 9:30 appointment with Dr. Mendez." Amanda's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her gaze lingering a fraction too long on Leah's designer handbag before sliding to her face. "Insurance card." The question came out clipped, almost challenging, despite Leah having already placed her premium insurance card on the counter. Behind Amanda, the other 2 receptionists had abandoned any pretense of work, watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. One leaned over to whisper something to her colleague, both stealing furtive glances at Leah. The whispers weren't quite quiet enough to miss entirely. Must be new here. And probably confused about. Leah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation she'd learned to recognize from countless similar situations throughout her professional life. She maintained her composed expression, a skill honed through years of being the only black woman in high-level meetings. Amanda scrutinized the insurance card with exaggerated thoroughness, her brow furrowing as if searching for discrepancies. A white couple approached the adjacent desk, where they were immediately greeted with warm smiles and casual conversation about the weather. The contrast wasn't lost on Leah, who focused on maintaining her dignified demeanor. "Take a seat in waiting area B," Amanda finally instructed, sliding the insurance card back across the counter with barely concealed skepticism. "Someone will call you. Eventually." The dismissive tone suggested Leah should be grateful for even this basic courtesy. Leah chose a seat with a clear view of both the reception desk and the corridor leading to the examination rooms. She pulled out her phone, pretending to check emails while actually observing the staff's behavior. The whispered conversations continued, punctuated by glances in her direction that ranged from curious to suspicious. A nurse emerged from the corridor, consulted briefly with the receptionists, and then cast an evaluating glance in Leah's direction before disappearing back through the secure doors. The pattern was familiar, the subtle choreography of prejudice dressed up as professional procedure. Time ticked by, marked by the steady rhythm of other patients being called ahead of her, despite having arrived later. Each time the door opened, Leah straightened slightly, maintaining her professional posture even as her appointment time came and went. The waiting room television droned on about the day's news, but she remained acutely aware of the continued whispers and sideways glances from the staff. Finally, nearly 30 minutes past her scheduled time, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Leah," she called out, just Leah, no Ms. or any other professional courtesy. The nurse's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as Leah rose gracefully from her seat, her designer outfit and professional bearing clearly at odds with whatever preconceptions the nurse had formed. Following the nurse through the winding corridors, Leah noticed how the young woman walked slightly ahead, maintaining an unusual distance as if reluctant to engage in the casual banter she could hear flowing freely from other exam rooms. The nurse's responses to Leah's polite questions about wait times and procedures were clipped and minimal, her body language tense and uninviting. The examination room itself felt colder than the others they'd passed, its stark white walls and harsh fluorescent lighting adding to the sense of isolation. The nurse gestured vaguely toward the examination table, avoiding direct eye contact. "How'd you change into this?" she said, tossing a paper gown onto the table with noticeable indifference. "Doctor will be in eventually." The door closed with a finality that made Leah wince. As she changed into the paper gown, Leah tried to dismiss the familiar doubt creeping in. Was she reading too much into these interactions? Was she being oversensitive? But 15 years of navigating professional spaces had honed her ability to recognize the subtle signs of prejudice, the small indignities that others might dismiss as imagination or coincidence. Through the thin walls, she could hear the warm, cheerful voices of staff interacting with other patients. The contrast with her own reception was stark, a reminder that some things hadn't changed as much as people liked to pretend. Leah sat straight-backed on the examination table, her expensive clothes carefully folded on the chair beside her, and prepared herself for what she suspected would be yet another battle for basic dignity in a place where healing was supposed to be the priority. The sound of laughter drifted in from the nurses, station, light, casual, and notably different from the strained professionalism she'd encountered. Leah checked her watch, noting that another 15 minutes had passed since being shown to the room. She could feel the chill of the air conditioning against her skin through the thin paper gown, a physical reminder of her vulnerability in this sterile, unwelcoming space. The door swung open without a warning knock, and Dr. Mendez strode in, his eyes fixed on a tablet rather than his patient. His white coat, pristinely pressed, seemed to match the coldness of his demeanor. Without looking up, he pulled the rolling stool to the corner furthest from the examination table where Leah sat, maintaining a distance that felt deliberately calculated. "So," he began, his voice carrying the weary impatience of someone already convinced this was a waste of his time, "what brings you here today?" He still hadn't made eye contact, scrolling through what Leah assumed was her digital chart with obvious disinterest. "Good morning, Dr. Mendez," Leah responded, her tone measured and professional. "I'm here for my annual physical, and I have some concerns about—" "Let me see your insurance card again," he interrupted, finally glancing up. His eyes narrowed slightly as they took in her appearance, a flash of something, surprise, skepticism, crossing his features before he masked it with clinical indifference. Leah reached for her designer handbag, retrieving the premium insurance card she'd already presented twice that morning. Dr. Mendez examined it with the same exaggerated scrutiny the receptionist had shown, his lips pursing as if he were analyzing a suspicious document. "This is a very comprehensive plan," he commented, his tone suggesting he found this fact difficult to believe. "How did you come by this coverage?" The question hung in the air, laden with unspoken assumptions. Leah felt her jaw tighten, but maintained her composure. "Through my husband's hospital administration position," she replied simply, choosing not to elaborate further. Dr. Mendez made a non-committal sound, returning to his tablet. "Well, let's get through this quickly. I have actual emergencies waiting." The emphasis on actual wasn't subtle, implying that her presence was somehow less legitimate than his other patients. "Then I've been experiencing some persistent headaches," Leah began, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "They seem to be accompanied by—" "Probably just stress," he cut in, barely glancing up from his screen. "People like you often misinterpret basic symptoms. Have you considered that maybe you're just not getting enough rest? Or perhaps it's your—" His eyes flicked to her carefully maintained hairstyle, lifestyle choices. The casual dismissal of her concerns, coupled with the thinly veiled prejudice in his tone, caused Leah's professional veneer to crack slightly. "Dr. Mendez, I have a documented history of migraines, and these symptoms are different. If you'd look at my medical records, Ms." He glanced at his tablet again with exaggerated effort. "Leah, I've been practicing medicine for 20 years. I think I can distinguish between real medical concerns and—" He paused, a condescending smile playing at his lips. Internet-inspired self-diagnosis. The atmosphere in the small room grew heavier with each dismissive comment. Leah sat straighter, drawing on years of experience in handling professional discrimination. "My previous physician conducted several tests and established a baseline for—" Ah, yes, Dr. Mendez interrupted again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Your previous physician? And where was this? One of those community clinics? He didn't wait for an answer before continuing. Well, this is a proper medical facility, and we have standards here. Leah felt her pulse quicken, not from anxiety, but from a familiar, simmering anger. Actually, Dr. Mendez, my previous physician was Dr. Sarah Chen at Massachusetts General. She's quite well known in her field, and I have her complete reports if you'd care to review them. The mention of the prestigious hospital caused Dr. Mendez to pause momentarily, but he quickly recovered his dismissive demeanor. Even the best doctors can be accommodating to certain patients' demands. The real question is whether these symptoms you're claiming are legitimate medical concerns or just, he waved his hand vaguely, attention-seeking behavior. The implication was clear, and each word landed like a calculated insult. Leah watched as he performed the most cursory of examinations, barely touching her as if contact might somehow compromise his professional standing. His movements were mechanical, his observations clearly predetermined by his biases. Your blood pressure seems elevated, he noted with a hint of smugness. Probably all that salt in your diet. You people tend to… He caught himself, but the slip was obvious, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Leah's legal training kicked in, and she began mentally documenting every word, every gesture, every subtle indication of prejudice. The paper gown suddenly felt less like medical necessity and more like an attempt to strip her of her dignity, but she refused to let it succeed. Dr. Mendez, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had served her well in courtrooms and boardrooms. I would appreciate it if you could explain what you mean by you people. And perhaps we could discuss how such assumptions might affect the quality of care you're providing. Dr. Mendez's expression hardened at Leah's challenge, his professional facade cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. I don't appreciate the implication, he said, his voice tight with barely contained hostility. I treat all my patients equally, regardless of their background. My background, Leah repeated, her voice level but carrying an edge of steel. I'm curious, Dr. Mendez, what assumptions you've made about my background based on our brief interaction? The monitor beside them beeped steadily, marking the tension that filled the small examination room. Dr. Mendez shifted in his seat, uncomfortable now that his prejudices were being directly confronted. I simply meant that some patients, particularly those who may not have extensive experience with proper medical care, tend to exaggerate their symptoms based on information they've found online. Leah allowed his words to hang in the air for a moment before responding. I hold 2 degrees from Harvard. Dr. Mendez. My understanding of medical information is quite adequate. She reached for her phone, opening a carefully maintained health tracking app. I've documented every incident of these headaches, including duration, intensity, and accompanying symptoms. Would you like to review the data? His dismissive snort made his opinion clear. I'm sure you've done your research, he said, inflecting the last word with obvious disdain. But Google Medical School isn't quite the same as actual medical training. Actually, Leah continued, maintaining her composure, these observations were made at the suggestion of my neurologist at Johns Hopkins. I have her contact information if you'd like to consult with her. She watched as uncertainty flickered across his face, his assumptions about her clearly colliding with the reality she presented. Dr. Mendez's jaw clenched visibly. Ms. Leah, he began, deliberately dropping any professional courtesy. While I'm sure you believe you're being very thorough, sometimes these attempts at self-diagnosis can interfere with proper medical treatment. Perhaps if you spent less time on medical websites and more time following basic health guidelines. I don't recall mentioning any websites, Dr. Mendez, Leah interrupted, her voice carrying the precise tone she used when cross-examining hostile witnesses. I've been referring to documented medical history and professional consultations. Your persistent assumption that I'm relying on internet research rather than legitimate medical care is interesting. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Dr. Mendez realized he was dealing with someone far more formidable than he'd initially assumed. His pen tapped against the clipboard with increasing agitation. Well, if you're so well informed, perhaps you don't need my professional opinion at all. What I need, Dr. Mendez, is the standard of care that every patient deserves, regardless of their race, gender, or economic status. Would you like to discuss why you've decided I don't qualify for that basic professional courtesy? The monitor's steady beeping seemed to grow louder in the tense silence that followed. Dr. Mendez's face flushed, a mixture of anger and embarrassment coloring his features. I don't have to justify my medical expertise to you, he snapped, standing abruptly. If you're unhappy with my assessment, you're welcome to seek care elsewhere. Leah remained seated, her posture deliberately calm despite her racing heart. Before I do that, I'd like to ensure that my medical records accurately reflect this interaction. Would you please note in my chart that you've refused to review my documented symptoms or previous medical history? Dr. Mendez froze, his hand halfway to the door handle. The legal implications of her request weren't lost on him. I haven't refused anything. He backpedaled, his tone suddenly more cautious. I'm simply suggesting that your concerns might be better addressed by someone more aligned with your expectations. My expectation is professional medical care, Dr. Mendez. Nothing more, nothing less. Leah's voice remained steady, but her eyes held his with unwavering intensity. Would you say that's an unreasonable expectation for any patient? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Through the thin walls, they could hear the murmur of normal hospital activity. Nurses chatting, phones ringing, other doctors consulting with patients in a professional manner that stood in stark contrast to their current interaction. Now, Leah continued, her professional demeanor unwavering, shall we start this consultation over, with you treating me as you would any other patient with my medical history and symptoms? Or should I request that the hospital administration review why certain patients receive different standards of care in this facility? Dr. Mendez's professional veneer shattered completely, replaced by naked contempt. Listen here, he hissed, taking a menacing step toward Leah, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I've dealt with your type before. Coming in here with your designer clothes and rehearsed medical terminology, thinking you can dictate how I practice medicine. Leah didn't flinch, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The paper gown crinkled as she straightened her spine, refusing to be intimidated despite her vulnerable state. My type, Dr. Mendez. Please, elaborate on exactly what you mean by that. Patients who think that reading WebMD makes them medical experts, he sneered, though they both knew that wasn't what he really meant. You come in here questioning my methods, my expertise. I'm questioning your prejudice, Leah cut in, her voice sharp as a scalpel, and your unprofessional behavior, which I've been documenting since the moment you walked in. Would you like me to recap? The dismissal of my symptoms without examination, the repeated interruptions, the condescending remarks about my background, the refusal to review my medical history. Are you threatening me? Dr. Mendez's face contorted with rage. His hand gripped his clipboard so tightly his knuckles whitened. Because I assure you, if you're thinking of filing some baseless complaint, nothing baseless about it, Leah replied coolly, reaching for her phone. Would you like to hear the recording of our interaction? Hospital policy clearly states that patients have the right to record their medical consultations for personal records. I started recording the moment you walked in without knocking. The color drained from Dr. Mendez's face, replaced by a sickly pallor. You had no right? I had every right, Leah countered, her voice steady. Just as I had every right to expect professional medical care instead of prejudiced assumptions and medical negligence. Shall we listen to the part where you made thinly veiled racial comments about my diet? Or perhaps the moment you dismissed my Harvard education in favor of your own biased presumptions. Dr. Mendez paced the small room like a caged animal, his earlier smugness evaporating under the weight of potential consequences. "You're clearly hysterical," he spat out, grasping for control. "I'll note that in your chart, patient became aggressive and unreasonable, displaying signs of paranoid behavior." "By all means," Leah responded, her finger hovering over her phone's screen. "Add that to the recording. I'm sure the medical board will be very interested in how you document your discriminatory practices." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Dr. Mendez's professional mask cracked completely, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath. "You know what? We're done here. I'm not obligated to treat patients who refuse to respect medical authority." "Medical authority?" Leah's laugh was sharp and without humor. "Is that what you call this display of bigotry and unprofessionalism? Please, do explain to me how dismissing documented medical history and making racist assumptions constitutes medical authority." Dr. Mendez grabbed his clipboard, scribbling furiously. "I'm noting your refusal to cooperate with examination procedures." "No, what you're doing is attempting to cover your tracks," Leah interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of years of legal experience. "But you should know that altering medical records to conceal discriminatory treatment is a serious offense. One that the hospital board tends to view rather unfavorably." He froze mid-scribble, his pen hovering over the paper. "Are you recording this too?" The question came out as a hostile whisper. "Every word," Leah confirmed, her composure unshaken. "Including your attempt to falsify medical records. Would you like to continue, Dr. Mendez? Or shall we discuss how this situation might be resolved professionally?" Instead of responding, Dr. Mendez stormed toward the door, his white coat billowing behind him like a surrender flag. "Another doctor will be in to complete your examination," he snapped, yanking the door open. "I wash my hands of this entire situation." "I'm sure you do," Leah called after him, her voice carrying down the hallway. "And I'm sure the hospital administration will be very interested in exactly why you're washing your hands of a patient who simply requested professional medical care." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the medical instruments on the nearby tray, leaving Leah alone in the suddenly quiet room. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The confrontation had left her shaking with a mixture of anger and adrenaline, but she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Leah dressed methodically, each movement deliberate and controlled despite her trembling hands. Her designer suit armor once again in place, she stepped into the hallway with renewed purpose, her heels clicking against the linoleum with military precision. Instead of heading toward the exit, she turned left, toward the administrative wing. The change in atmosphere was immediate and striking. The institutional sterility of the examination areas gave way to warm wooden paneling and tasteful artwork. A security guard stationed at the entrance to the administrative section straightened as she approached, his eyes widening in recognition. "Mrs. Vargas!" He rushed to open the door for her, his genuine warmth a stark contrast to her earlier treatment. "We weren't expecting you today. Is everything all right?" Leah managed a tight smile. "Not exactly, James." "Is Richard in his office?" "Dr. Vargas is in a board meeting, but he should be finishing up soon. Would you like me to let his assistant know you're here?" Before Leah could respond, Amanda, the same receptionist who had treated her with such disdain earlier, rounded the corner carrying a stack of files. She stopped dead in her tracks, her face draining of color as she recognized Leah. The files nearly slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. "Mrs. Vargas," Amanda stammered, her earlier contempt replaced by horrified recognition. I didn't realize. This morning, I should have..." "Yes," Leah replied coolly. "There seemed to be quite a few things you should have done differently this morning." She turned back to James. "Would you mind letting Sarah know I'm heading to Richard's office? I'll wait for him there." The administrative wing buzzed with activity, but a hush fell over the staff as Leah passed. Whispers followed in her wake. and she could see the moment of realization dawn on each face. This was the hospital director's wife, the woman who had spearheaded their diversity and inclusion initiatives, who had fought to establish the free clinic in the underserved east side of the city. Through the glass walls of the administrative offices, she caught sight of Dr. Mendez at the nurse's station, presumably complaining about his difficult patient. He was gesturing animatedly to a colleague, his face still flushed with indignation. The colleague's eyes widened suddenly, looking past him to where Leah stood in the doorway of the executive wing. Dr. Mendez turned, following his colleague's gaze. The color drained from his face as he saw Leah being ushered through the secure doors by respectful staff members. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as the implications of his actions began to sink in. "Dr. Mendez," the colleague whispered urgently. "Do you realize who that is?" The doctor's face had taken on an ashen hue. "I don't." "That's Leah Vargas," another nurse interjected, her voice heavy with significance. "Dr. Vargas's wife, the one who established the hospital's patient advocacy program." Leah could see the information hit him like a physical blow. His earlier bravado evaporated, replaced by naked fear as he watched her disappear into the executive suite. The irony wasn't lost on her. Only now, faced with her status rather than her humanity, did he understand the magnitude of his mistake. Sarah, Richard's assistant of 15 years, rushed to greet her. "Leah, what brings you to our side of the building? And why didn't you let me know you were coming in for an appointment? I would have made sure you were properly taken care of." "That's exactly why I didn't say anything, Sarah," Leah replied, her voice carrying through the now silent office. "Every patient deserves proper care, not just the ones who have connections to administration." Through the glass walls, she could see Dr. Mendez frantically questioning his colleagues, presumably trying to gather information about her role at the hospital. The same staff members who had witnessed his behavior earlier now watched with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension as the situation rapidly unraveled around him. "Dr. Vargas should be finishing up any minute," Sarah informed her, leading her to the comfortable waiting area outside the director's office. "Would you like me to get you anything while you wait? And should I—" She glanced meaningfully at Dr. Mendez through the glass. "Inform HR that they might be needed." "That won't be necessary just yet," Leah responded, her voice carrying just far enough to reach the increasingly panicked doctor. "I believe my husband will want to handle this situation personally." Dr. Ricardo Vargas's footsteps echoed down the corridor, his commanding presence preceding him. Through the glass walls, Leah watched her husband approach, noting how others instinctively straightened in his presence. His distinguished gray temples and impeccable suit marked him as someone accustomed to wielding authority. But it was the intensity of his dark eyes that commanded attention. He paused at Sarah's desk, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to concern as his assistant whispered something urgent in his ear. His head snapped up, eyes finding Leah through the glass. 20 years of marriage allowed them to communicate volumes in a single glance. "Sarah?" His deep voice carried clearly. "Please have Dr. Mendez report to my office immediately." He turned to the security guard. "James, I want you outside my door during this meeting." Dr. Mendez arrived moments later, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible anxiety. He'd hastily straightened his coat and attempted to smooth his disheveled hair, but nothing could hide the fear etched across his features. The security guard ushered him into the office where Leah and Ricardo waited, the door closing behind him with a decisive click. "Dr. Mendez," Ricardo began, his voice deceptively calm. "Please, take a seat." The invitation carried the weight of a command. Mendez sank into the offered chair, his eyes darting between husband and wife. The spacious office suddenly felt suffocating, its elegant decor a stark reminder of the power dynamic he'd so catastrophically misread. "I understand you treated my wife this morning," Ricardo continued, standing behind his desk. "What I don't understand is why I'm hearing reports of discriminatory behavior from multiple staff members who witnessed your interaction." "Dr. Vargas, I can explain," Mendez stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Leah interjected, her voice steady as she pulled out her phone. "Should we review the recording of our consultation? I'm particularly interested in your comments about my type of patient and your assumptions about my educational background." Color drained from Mendez's face as Leah played selected snippets of their interaction. His own voice, dripping with condescension and barely veiled prejudice, filled the elegant office. Ricardo's expression darkened with each passing moment, his hands gripping the back of his chair until his knuckles whitened. "I didn't know who she was," Mendez blurted out when the recording stopped. The moment the words left his mouth, he seemed to realize his mistake. "That," Ricardo said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "is precisely the problem, Doctor Mendez. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic human dignity and professional respect." Leah leaned forward, her composure unshakable. "The issue isn't that you disrespected the hospital director's wife. It's that you believed it was acceptable to disrespect any patient based on their race or perceived social status." I didn't mean," Mendez floundered, his excuses withering under their combined scrutiny. You didn't mean to be recorded," Ricardo corrected. "You didn't mean to choose the wrong target for your prejudice. Tell me, Dr. Mendez, how many other patients have received similar treatment? How many people without the means or influence to challenge you have suffered through your professional care, right?" The silence that followed was deafening. Through the glass walls, staff members tried to appear busy while obviously straining to observe the unfolding drama. Sarah had positioned herself strategically near the door, her hand hovering over the phone, ready to call HR if needed. "My wife," Ricardo continued, his controlled tone belying his anger, "has spent years advocating for equal treatment in healthcare. She's established programs, fought for policy changes, and worked tirelessly to ensure that every patient who walks through our doors receives respectful, professional care." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And you, Dr. Mendez, have just provided a perfect example of why her work is still so desperately needed." Mendez slumped in his chair, the full weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. His carefully constructed professional world was crumbling around him, destroyed by his own bigotry and the assumption that he could act with impunity. "I should inform you," Ricardo added, his tone glacial, "that as of this moment, you are suspended pending a full investigation of your conduct. Please surrender your hospital ID to security on your way out. And Dr. Mendez?" He waited until the trembling doctor met his gaze. "Expect to hear from our legal department regarding this incident." The news of Dr. Mendez's suspension spread through Metropolitan General like wildfire, igniting conversations in every corner of the sprawling facility. Nurses huddled in break rooms, discussing in hushed tones how they'd witnessed his behavior degrading over years, but had never felt empowered to speak up. Administrative staff shared knowing looks, recalling times they'd heard complaints about his treatment of minority patients, but had dismissed them as mere grumblings. Doctor Mendez shuffled through the hospital corridors one last time, escorted by security. His head bowed as he passed former colleagues. His hospital ID, now deactivated, hung limply from his pocket, a symbol of his fallen status. Staff members who had laughed at his jokes just hours ago now turned away, suddenly fascinated by their paperwork or computer screens. The walk of shame culminated at his office, where he was given 20 minutes to collect personal belongings under supervision. Photos of his medical school graduation, fellowship certificates, and years of accolades seemed to mock him now. As he packed them away, his hands trembling, he caught snippets of conversation from the hallway. "So, did you hear what he said to her? Can you believe he didn't even look at her medical history? All those times we saw him treating patients differently, we should have said something." In the administrative wing, Leah sat with the hospital's HR director and legal team, methodically going through her recording. Her composed demeanor belied the emotional toll of the morning, but her voice remained steady as she outlined her expectations for systemic change. "This isn't just about Dr. Mendez," she explained, her legal background emerging in her precise articulation. "This is about creating accountability at every level. How many other patients have suffered in silence? How many complaints have been dismissed because the victims lacked my connections or resources?" The HR director, a woman who had worked with Leah on diversity initiatives, nodded gravely. "We're implementing immediate changes to our patient feedback system. Anonymous reporting channels, regular patient surveys focusing on discrimination, mandatory cultural competency training for all staff, and regular audits of patient treatment patterns," Leah added. "I want data on wait times, treatment decisions, and pain management protocols broken down by race, gender, and socioeconomic status. If there are systemic biases, we need to identify and address them." Meanwhile, in the hospital cafeteria, a group of young residents huddled around a table, their usual laughter replaced by serious discussion. "You know," one of them said, pushing her salad around thoughtfully, "I've seen attendings dismiss patients like that before. We all have. But we never speak up because we're afraid of ruining our careers." "That changes today," another resident declared. Did you hear what Dr. Vargas said? Every patient deserves respect, regardless of who they are or who they know. We need to start holding each other accountable." By late afternoon, Dr. Mendez sat alone in his car in the hospital parking lot, staring at the building where he'd worked for 15 years. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from colleagues and friends, but he couldn't bring himself to read them. The weight of his actions, the realization of how his biases had poisoned his practice of medicine, pressed down on him like a physical force. Inside, Ricardo and Leah conducted an emergency staff meeting, turning the morning's events into a teaching moment. "Healthcare isn't a privilege," Leah addressed the packed auditorium, her voice carrying to every corner. "It's a basic human right. And the quality of care shouldn't depend on your clothes, your education, or the color of your skin." The employees, from janitors to chief surgeons, listened in rapt attention as she shared not just the morning's events, but years of similar experiences she'd witnessed or endured. Many shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing their own subtle biases in her words. "Starting tomorrow," Ricardo announced, "we're implementing new protocols for reporting and addressing discrimination. But more importantly, we're asking each of you to examine your own biases, question your assumptions, challenge discriminatory behavior when you see it, be the change we need in healthcare." As the sun set over Metropolitan General, Leah gathered her belongings, exhausted but satisfied. The day's events would have lasting repercussions, not just for Dr. Mendez, but for the entire institution. Already, staff members were approaching her with their own stories, their own commitments to do better. Dr. Mendez's career at Metropolitan General was over, but the conversation he had inadvertently sparked was just beginning. His disgrace would serve as a powerful reminder that in the healing profession, there was no room for prejudice, no excuse for discrimination. And in the end, his greatest contribution to medicine would not be his years of practice, but the lesson his downfall taught about the fundamental importance of treating every patient with dignity and respect.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.